Chapter 5 of your text is entitled, God is Good. We learn from Psalm 107, verse 1, "Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for He is good." We have other references in Scripture, or from one end of Scripture to the other, that make the claim that God is a good God. But His goodness, of course, is invisible to us, like other characteristics and attributes of God. But He wishes to illustrate His goodness to us through physical things in the creation. And it turns out there's a variety of ways He could do that. There's a variety of ways anyone can illustrate their goodness. One is to, in fact, anticipate the needs that a person or an individual has and meet them ahead of time. And we're actually going to see that God has done that. We're going to see that in chapter 7 that's coming up ahead of us. It's also possible for a person to show their goodness by meeting the needs of others as they come up, waiting for the needs to arise and then meeting them at that time. Turns out God has done that as well in the biological world. We'll see that in chapter 8. In this particular chapter, we're going to look at another way that God shows His goodness to us, to the world, and that's being a help or a benefit in a relationship kind of situation. And so this, in the biological world, is something we call mutualism. Mutualism is actually a special type of long-term relationship where, in fact, organisms benefit each other. Multiple organisms enter into a relationship over the long term that has a benefit to each member. God didn't actually create organisms to be autonomous, to live separately. He created them to interact, and to interact at various levels of dependency upon each other. And when two organisms are in a long-term relationship with each other, in biology we call that a symbiosis. Sym meaning together or at the same time, bios referring to life. So this is living organisms being in the same place or interacting with each other for a long period of time. We're going to be looking ultimately at several different types of symbioses. The first one we'll consider here is the type of symbiosis known as commensalism. This is where two organisms do interact over a long period of time, but the one organism seems to benefit from the relationship, but the other doesn't seem to benefit at all. Examples here might be lichens that grow on the bark of a tree. The lichens are benefited by being up out of the leaves so that they can photosynthesize, but it doesn't seem to, as far as we can tell, either benefit or hurt the tree for the lichens to be covering the tree. This would be an example of a long-term relationship that benefits the one, the lichen, but doesn't seem to benefit or harm the other individual, the other species. That would be commensalism. What we're going to focus on in this particular chapter is mutualism. This is a type of long-term relationship where in the interaction, both members, both species, in fact, benefit from the relationship. So a mutualism is defined as a long-term biological relationship between two organisms that results in benefit to both individuals. There are two different types of mutualism, or this is often classified into two different categories. There's something called facultative mutualism, where the two organisms do interact over long periods of time and provide mutual benefit to each other, but you could potentially separate the two and they can get along quite well without each other. They might get along better together, but they don't die by being separated. That would be facultative mutualism. In contrast, we have examples of obligate mutualism, where if in fact you tried to separate the two organisms, they would either die immediately or they would not be able to reproduce. those kinds of situations, the organisms must be in mutualistic relationship for them to thrive and survive at all. And so we're going to look at cases of obligate mutualism. There's a range of different types, from those where we're involving two radically different organisms, things that just about everybody would recognize. Oh, there's one organism, there's a very different organism. They're both large enough that humans can see them and distinguish them readily. We have classic examples here of the figs and the fig wasps. For a long time, figs have been grown for a long time for food, of course, and people began to realize as they took fig trees that they wanted and planted them in a different location, very often they didn't get any figs. Trying to figure out why that was the case, we eventually realized that there's actually a pollinator for the figs, a particular wasp, which we've come to call a fig wasp, that lives in and among the figs, pollinates the figs, and depends upon the figs for food and for survival. And the figs are in fact dependent upon the wasp to pollinate and thus produce offspring. So although the figs don't die if the fig wasps aren't there, they can't produce offspring, and so they can't reproduce. So we began to realize that if you wanted a fig tree in a new location, you had to take the figs and the fig wasps, make sure you brought them over both at the same time. Something very similar is found in the case of yucca and yucca moths. Yucca plants are fertilized by yucca moths, and yucca moths depend upon the yucca plants for their survival as well. So if you want to plant yucca plants in another location, you got to make sure, and you want them to not just flower, but produce young yucca plants, seeds for the next generation, then you need to bring along the yucca moths. If you don't bring the yucca moths, the yucca plants will grow. They might even flower, but they'll never produce seeds and thus continue their species. On a different level, we have examples which may not be obvious examples of mutualism, but we have relationships between, for example, grass and cattle that eat the grass. Now, clearly the cattle are benefiting by eating the grass. You might say, but that doesn't seem to be a very good benefit to the grass that's being consumed. But if you look at the nature, the structure, the design of plants, in particular grass, you'll find that most of the food value, most of the life, if you wish, of grass is beneath the surface. It's in the roots of the grass, which means you can cut the grass all the way down to the ground, you can chew the grass off, and you haven't killed the grass. So it doesn't actually kill the grass for the cattle to eat it. And if you do that, if you chew the grass down, the grass is actually stimulated to produce more blades of grass for photosynthesis purposes. And the grass actually thrives under those circumstances of being grazed, of being what we call cropped or cut off. And the cattle come along and fertilize the ground with the cow chips and that sort of thing. So there's actually benefit to both species here, the grass species and the cattle species. In fact, the grass and other browsers turns out to be a mutualistic relationship where each benefit from the other's presence. You also have a relationship between plants and certain animals that carry the seeds of the plants. The plants will produce fruit in some cases with the seeds inside so that animals eat the fruit, ingest the seeds. The seeds are strong enough to go through the digestive system of the animal, are pooped out basically onto the ground. The seed is then in a very fertile mixture. It hasn't been destroyed by the digestive system of the animal. The seed has been moved from wherever the plant lived to a new location, has been put into a fertile situation, and thus plants spread themselves in this fashion. Other plants produce burrs, things that stick on the fur of animals as they walk by the plant, and the animals then carry the burrs. The burrs will contain seeds, They carry the seeds some distance away from the plant, scratch off the burr. The burr falls down in the ground. That spreads the plant. In the case of especially those that are eating fruit, the birds or the animals that are eating the fruit benefit from this process, and of course the plants do as well. So we have a relationship here where plants and animals benefit each other by being in long-term relationship. We also have examples of obligate mutualism where it's not so obvious that we have more than one organism. It looks like, in fact, some instances are so interrelated, where the two organisms are so intertwined that it looks like a single organism. The classic example here would be the lichens, the group that I've referred to more than once already in our lectures. The lichen is composed of a fungus and an alga, or the plural of that would be algae. It's these two come together and become something that looks like just one organism. You can only see the lichen and the color of the algae. You cannot see the individuals in that particular instance. But those two species interact so intimately together. If you take them apart, they die separately, because the algae feeds the fungus and the fungus provides water and protection for the algae. In fact, those two species are so intertwined that scientists don't classify lichens according to either the fungus species or the alga species. They actually give lichens their own names. There are thousands of species of lichens. They're classified as lichens. They're given names as lichens, as independent, just because they're lichens, as if they are a separate organism. They're not. They're two organisms put together, but they're not named on the basis of either of the organisms. They're so intimately related that, or put together, that they're classified as lichens. There are also instances where you have one organism in the symbiotic relationship is so small or so embedded within another organism of larger size that you never know about the existence of the little guy. There's lots of examples in this area. For example, in coral reefs, the dominant organisms on a coral reef would be the corals and the sponges. And in each of those cases, many of the corals, many of the sponges, are actually not just those animals, and a coral is an animal and a sponge is an animal, but very often there are tiny single-celled photosynthetic algae that live inside the coral, live inside the sponges, that and the two work together so that the algae, again, if given enough light, will in fact feed the sponge or the coral. And the coral grows in such a way that it grows up towards the light as if it was a plant. It kind of looks like it grows like a plant. It looks like a plant in many ways, but it isn't. It's an animal. But it grows upwards so that the photosynthetic algae that is within the animal can in fact photosynthesize well. So clearly the animal, the big animal, protects the little algae that's inside. Usually they're dinoflagellate algae that are inside the corals and sponges, and the dinoflagellates feed the coral and sponges. So those are unseen partners. Another example of an unseen partner, but extremely important, would be plants and what we call mycorrhizal fungi. Turns out when we look at a very large tree in particular, a tree requires a tremendous amount of water to do its photosynthesis. It's got to draw huge amounts of water out of the ground, many nutrients out of the ground. The more we study plants, the more we realize that especially the very large trees actually don't have the capacity, the ability to pull enough water and nutrients in to supply the needs of the large tree. A very large tree in the middle of the summer, for example, will require 100 gallons of water a day, which is a lot of water to pull out of the ground and to bring up to the leaves. The plant itself seems not to be capable of pulling that much water in. So what we've discovered is, looking closely at the roots, we find that there are fungi that actually looks like the fungi are invading the root. They exist outside the root in long tubular structures, and they seem to kind of invade the root, as if it almost looks like a disease or something. But upon examination, you realize the fungi isn't actually hurting the plant. What the fungi is doing is pulling in water, pumping it or piping it over to the plant, and giving water to the plant. The plant then takes the water up to the leaves, produces food, sends food back down to the roots and to the fungi, feeding the fungi. So the fungi is pulling in water and nutrients, which fungi are just have an amazing ability of pulling things in, far better than any other kind of organism on the planet. So they're specially designed to be suckers of water and nutrients for the plant. The plant feeds the fungi, and so the two species work in symbiosis. Normally, the mycorrhizal fungi, we call those fungi mycorrhizal. Myco means fungus, and rhizae refers to the roots. They're root fungi that we usually don't notice. They're so very small that we have only discovered them in the last few decades of time, and we're beginning to realize that perhaps mycorrhizal fungi are found in just about every plant on the planet, helping the plants to pull in water and nutrients. We also find this in the form of legumes and their nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There are certain plants that actually create special structures, usually in their roots, to house bacteria that are capable of taking nitrogen from the gaseous state in the atmosphere and changing the nitrogen into a form that can be used by the plant. So the plants are being fed nutrients by the bacteria are being given a protective home by the plant. The plants that do this most frequently are known as legumes, the peas, the beans, those kinds of plants, and there are some trees in here, the locusts and so on, are capable of actually housing nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria produce so much nutrient that there's more than enough for the bacterium, the plant, and in fact they increase the fertility of the soil. So they not just help the legumes themselves, but associated plants in that system. Another example would be animals and what we call the gut flora. Back years ago, we used to classify organisms into really two categories, animals and plants. And included in this group called plants were not just the things we know of as plants, but also the fungi, which are now put up as their own kingdom, separate from the plants, and the bacteria, which are also in kingdoms separate from the plants now. But back then, they used to all be put together with the algae and so on. And we would refer to, let's say we're looking at a particular ecosystem with a bunch of animals and a bunch of plants, we would refer to the animals of an area as the fauna of an area. The plants of an area would be referred to as the flora of an area. So if you look inside the intestines of animals, large animals, you will find a bunch of bacteria in there that are living there quite happily, because we used to call those things plants. They are part of the flora, or the plants found in the body of animals. So even insects like termites have in their intestines bacteria that are living in the intestines and are supposed to be there. They are called the gut, intestinal flora of the organism. We didn't know what they did for a long time, and we still don't know what a lot of them do, even today, but it appears that they help digest the food that animals in fact consume. Turns out animals are not capable of decomposing or breaking down into food, into nutrients, things that plants make. The cellulose, which is the most common plant molecule in the world. In fact, it's the most common biological molecule in the world. Animals can't decompose it, can't break it down. But there are bacteria that can, and those bacteria are found in the guts of animals. In our guts, in our intestines, we have bacteria that help us break down things like lettuce and the crispy stuff that makes up plants. We actually can't digest. There are symbiotic bacteria. There are bacteria that are living in a symbiotic relationship with us, in a mutualistic relationship with us, that are doing that digestion. Cattle can't digest grass. They've got microorganisms in their intestines, stomachs and intestines, that actually break the grass down and supply the food for the animal. Obviously, the animal is feeding the bacterium, and the bacterium is creating food for the animal. It appears that every animal, certainly every large animal, has a gut flora that helps them digest things. The more we learn about organisms, the more we find that mutualism is found everywhere in the world. Mutualism is ubiquitous. We are beginning to suspect that every single organism on the planet is probably in mutualistic relationship with at least one other organism on the planet. And it may be that as we measure the amount of commensalism in the world, and we're going to get to another type of symbiotic relationship of parasitism, if we compare all the types of symbioses in the world, it may well be, it appears to be, that mutualism is the most common of all the symbiotic relationships that organisms are in. Every organism is involved in at least one mutualistic relationship, and it's very likely that all large organisms, organisms large enough for us to see, actually have many mutualisms inside their body. Many microorganisms are in mutualistic relationship with them. Thus, mutualism is very deep in biology. It's at every scale, from the tiniest organisms to the largest organisms. It is everywhere. It is found in the fact that plants actually take in carbon dioxide and give out oxygen, and animals take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. So even at the really big scale on the whole planet, plants and animals are in mutualistic relationship. And all the way down to within cells. It appears that viruses are in symbiotic relationship with cells. So from the very smallest things in biology to the very largest things in biology, mutualism seems to be dominant at every scale. Where did this come from? In theory, there's more than one way to consider how a bunch of different things can coexist at the same time. Our government has a particular way of having multiple things exist at the same time, multiple humans exist in the same culture, and that is, let's give every individual in the culture the same amount of power. We're going to assume that they're all selfish and they all want to go exactly where they want to go, and it's a different direction than everybody else. So it's like everybody is grabbed onto one huge round rope that's attached at the ends, and everybody is running in their own directions, pulling in their own directions, in every direction. And if everybody is given the same power, and they're all about the same strength, then the rope is going to keep them kind of in the same place. No one team is going to pull the rope in one direction or another. You can sort of balance the powers that are around some central point with the assumption of everything being really bad. Everybody's trying to do bad things, but everyone's trying to do different bad things. So you can balance the power in that sense. It's a weird way of doing things, but it is the way our government is designed. Every individual is given the same amount of power, and we hope that no group gets too much power and thus pulls everybody else over into their selfish direction. And in fact, in the naturalistic worldview, that's basically what naturalism believes this world is, what's going on in this world, in the biological world. In naturalism, in evolutionary theory that generated organisms, organisms are competing with other organisms. That if you're an organism that's trying to survive, you're trying to get to food and to produce offspring before your neighbor gets to the food, before you do. You want to get there first. You want to produce offspring and survive as opposed to everyone else. So you're struggling against everyone else. You're competing with everyone else around you. Kind of like that. There's a state of war going on. And the people you're competing most against are the people that are most similar to you because they probably want to eat the same food that you do. So evolution has been described by various people down through the years as survival of the fittest. There's a struggle that only the fittest are going to make it. There's a struggle for survival. It's described as nature red, tooth and claw. We have this, you're clawing and biting to get what you want. There's blood all over the place. It's basically nature is evil. All organisms are evil. They're all selfish. They're all trying to compete against every other organism in the world. Consequently, mutualism is not expected in a naturalistic worldview. Naturalism expects that the world is at war, that it is not full of organisms that, in fact, interact positively with one another. Now, you might expect a few, maybe, but you certainly wouldn't expect that mutualism is extremely common, that it is ubiquitous, it is everywhere, it is common, and it is deep. But that is true of mutualism in the world. So it appears that Christian theism is really the only way to explain the mutualism that we find in the world about us. It can only really be explained by a God who is good, who wants to show His goodness to us by putting relationships of mutualism, putting organisms into mutualistic relationships throughout life, at every depth, commonly, at every scale, in order to show us that He, a good God, in fact created things. It can't be explained by naturalism. It can only be explained by a God, a good God, having created things the way they are. Nature, the biological world, drips with mutualism. And that dripping with mutualism can only be explained by a God who is good, who created the world that we see about us.